Hi, my name is Mohammed Tahai. Thank you very much for attending our talk today. I'm going to talk to you about privacy-related advice on Stack Overflow. I did this research with Tianxi Li from Carnegie Mellon University and Cami Vanier from the University of Edinburgh. The main idea behind this research is to find out how developers make use of privacy frameworks. So, for example, when we talk about privacy design strategies, we wanted to better understand how these strategies are applied and used by developers. We've got all sorts of privacy regulations and laws coming into action in the past few years. For example, we've got GDPR in Europe, or CCPA and COPPA in the United States. And we've got other privacy regulations in other countries that are being introduced to protect citizens' privacy. However, these regulations and laws are very high level and difficult to understand for developers. So these laws and regulations, for example, may talk about protecting privacy, but not necessarily give detailed guides about how to achieve it in the technical level. There have been efforts by the research community to make that transition easier for developers and translate those requirements or guidelines provided by those regulations to a more understanding technical requirement. However, it's not very clear how developers make use of these frameworks and how much they can help developers in building privacy-friendly applications. We wanted to better understand how developers make use of these frameworks. We decided to focus on one specific framework, which is called Privacy Design Strategies, suggested by Hopman. It's one level below privacy by design because it tries to really target developers and designers and provide a detailed guide for considering privacy in the design stages. We also decided to focus on Stack Overflow as a source of advice for developers because it's the largest Q&A platform for developers. So in the first research question, we wanted to understand how does privacy advice developers give one another on Stack Overflow relate to the privacy design strategies suggested by Hopman. In the second research question, we wanted to understand what advice and information do developers give one another on Stack Overflow to address privacy issues. We decided to focus on Stack Overflow because it's the largest Q&A platform for developers. They ask different types of questions here, including programming questions, of course, and also topics around privacy, security, and databases. In a Kai paper in 2020, we focused on the questions that developers ask as a source of confusions and challenges they face while working with privacy topics. We found that privacy policies are very difficult for them to manage, permissions, and in general, protecting user privacy are confusing topics for developers. However, at the time, we didn't focus on the answers. And since then, there haven't been research focusing on the answers that developers give one another on privacy topics. So in this research, we focus on the answers as a source of advice. Before I jump in to the method section, I wanted to briefly introduce the privacy design strategies that we used in this paper. So it has 8 different strategies. Very briefly, Minimize talks about limiting the processing of personal information. Separate talks about separating the processing of data as much as possible. So instead of processing everything on one central unit, process the data on multiple units. Abstract talks about limiting the details of personal data. So for example, instead of using find location, use course location. Hide talks about making sure that the data doesn't become public or known, for example, by using some encryption methods. Inform talks about informing subjects about the processing of their personal data. Control talks about giving adequate control to the subjects over the processing of their personal data. Enforce talks about committing the organization to a privacy-friendly data processing. And demonstrate ensures that the privacy-friendly data processing is also demonstrated. To answer our research questions, we collected 170 privacy-related posts from Stack Overflow. These were created between April 2016 to April 2021. All these posts contained a privacy tag and they all had an accepted answer. We chose to focus on the accepted answers because we wanted to make sure that those answers did actually fix the asker's problem. So those answers are marked as accepted by the asker of the question. With the classic bottom-up qualitative analysis with two coders, which you can find more details about it in the paper. We found that there are two types of posts. In 48 of the posts, users discussed protecting their own privacy. For example, how can I protect my own privacy on GitHub? By removing my email address or my username from Git logs. And in 119 posts, they discussed user privacy, which is the focus of this study. We extracted 148 pieces of advice from these posts. I'm going to briefly talk about the findings. So first of all, we mapped all those pieces of advice to privacy design strategies. We found that inform and hide are the most commonly used strategies by developers. For example, trying to inform users about what kinds of data they're collecting and what they're doing with their data. Hide means, like for example, using some encryption methods. Control means in addition to informing users, they wanted to make sure that users are also given a choice and control over processing of their data. Minimize, for example, talks about minimizing data collection. And interestingly, we didn't observe abstract and separate coming up as much. Enforce and demonstrate the same. They came up very rarely. I'm going to talk about the implications of these in the next slides. We also analyzed the posts for generally the advice that developers give one another around privacy. We found that mostly the advice is about making sure that they are compliant with the regulations and their consequences. For example, one user said, before requesting permission, you could display an alert that explains why are you going to request permission. You can use whatever text you like in this alert. And in the second group of advice, they talked about ensuring confidentiality, for example, by using some sort of encryption. For example, one user said, make sure you have set all applicable HTTP security headers, and if you are not already, you should be using HTTPS, even for a static site. The third group of advice talked about avoiding data collection. For example, one user said, there is one very simple way of avoiding all the negative consequences of third-party cookies. Don't have any. It's possible to do a great many things without them. It means that you may not need to display cookie notifications or seek consent. So as you can see, interestingly, there are some really privacy-conscious users on Stack Overflow who are suggesting others not to even collect data from the get-go because it's going to make their life easier in the future because they don't need to take care of removing or storing the data in a privacy-preserving manner. And in the last group of advice, they talked about understanding and reading more about third-party services. For example, in this example, the answerer posted a code snippet that helps the asker to find any code that uses location data in their application. Because the asker couldn't figure out why their app is using location data when they didn't intend it to. Apparently, somehow there was some location data being collected without the developer's knowledge. So the answer is saying, once you find the offending library, lib, you can try to figure out what purpose location data has been and then decide whether you can get rid of it. As you can see, third-party libraries and their privacy consequences can be very hard and tricky for developers to understand. So as a takeaway, we find that the most commonly applied privacy design strategies in our sample are inform and control. We think that these are most commonly used because app stores and mobile operating systems, specifically iOS and Android, are mostly focused on consent. which shows that the impact of app stores and operating systems on the developers community and their understanding around privacy. We did observe that some people talk about hide and minimize strategies. We think that perhaps because hide is slightly combined with security and encryption, therefore it's used more often. We did observe that the minimizer strategy used pretty often, which is very interesting for us because it shows that people are actually actively advising each other about minimizing data collection from the get-go. Very few people talked about enforce and demonstrate. We think that it might be because developers aren't asking a lot of organizational level questions on Stack Overflow, and perhaps these two strategies are more organizational level, so we didn't observe those coming up in our sample as much. Discussions around how to do data abstraction and separate data processing were very rare, which opens up a nice research direction for future to study why developers are not talking about these methods. Could it be because they aren't covered by the typical libraries and APIs that developers use? Or perhaps they are not covered in the app stores and operating systems? Or maybe developers are not just aware of them as much as the other strategies. So overall, we think that future research is needed to find out how we can better support developers in applying and making use of all the available privacy enhancing methods through the research community. Thank you very much for listening.